It's not every day that you have a Jupiter-8 sitting alongside a Memorymoog. These are holy grail synths that come from an era that produced the golden standard of polyphonic analog synths. These instruments have inspired countless musicians, songs, and other instruments in the form of digital emulations, VSTs, and modern recreations. And although it may be sacrilegious to some, today we're going to compare a Titan to a Titan. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music technology related. And today we have a really special treat. We have a Memorymoog alongside a Jupiter-8. And I'm honored to be able to be in the presence of both of these instruments at the same time. They're hard to find, they're rare, they're incredibly expensive. And in the case of the Memorymoog, they're often in disrepair and not working. So I feel incredibly privileged to be able to play on these, be able to talk about them. And these instruments have a kind of aura about them. Maybe it's completely in my head, but just being around them and their kind of monstrosity, their huge form factor is inspiring. And what's interesting is the quality of materials that went into these instruments. It's not often that we associate super high quality materials with things that are electronic. Often we, maybe not in the case of Apple, those feel sleek and high end, but a lot of times it's how can we make electronics cheaper, and faster and better. We're used to kind of a constant pressure to make things more efficient and less expensive. And with the Memorymoog and the Jupiter-8, this was from a different era of kind of instrument creation, where manufacturers were pursuing kind of the zenith pinnacle of instrument creation. These were cutting-edge synthesizers that used super high quality and cutting-edge materials. So the form factor and the build quality is incredibly kind of it almost feels like a high-end acoustic guitar or a high-end piano. It has that kind of acoustic living instrument feel. The Memorymoog has this beautiful cabinet, and the Jupiter has a beautiful color scheme, and the metal is just feels great. So all that to say, I'm always impressed when I see these kind of golden era polyphonic analog synths. They're the Prophet 5, the Yamaha CS80, the Oberheim OBXA. They all were aspiring to be a magical instrument, not just in the way it sounded, but even in the materials and the build quality. It's very foreign to, I think, the way we think about keyboards in general. So really from a magic era, I still think most synths are measured against both of these. So let's talk a little bit about what makes the JP8 different than the Memorymoog and what is unique about the Memorymoog that's not found in the Jupiter-8. So the Memorymoog came at the tail end of Moog's, actually it came at the very end of Moog's kind of first rung at instrument creation. The company was owned by a massive conglomerate. It was very trendy at the time for massive conglomerates, international conglomerates, to own music companies for whatever reason. CBS owned Fender during the same period. And I think the company that owned Memorymoog was primarily a beer manufacturer out of Colombia or something. I don't remember the story exactly, but it's kind of weird. And Bob Moog had left the company. He was no longer associated with it. And this instrument came at the end when it was financially struggling. They filed for bankruptcy shortly after producing this instrument. And there was about 3,500 units produced. There was two versions, a Memorymoog and a Memorymoog Plus. And it's really interesting, the serial number is handwritten on this Memorymoog. It's like 2652. Kind of strange, these were rushed out as they were trying to get to market, and it was 1983. This was one of the last mega poly analog synths that kind of came out with the idea of being great, but it was a little late to the party. Part of the reason that Moog was struggling is it really wasn't adapting to the digital era that was quickly kind of subsuming the entire synth community. I think the DX7 was released almost at the same time as the Memorymoog, and that became kind of the new trend. Cheaper, digital, more voices, more realistic sounds. There was a pursuit of realism at the time that was not really aligned with the kind of tonalities and palette that you get with analog synthesizers. So realism was in, analog synthesis was out. So the Memorymoog is considered to be an amazing polyphonic analog synth, but they often have issues and need kind of reconfiguration internally. There's like a upgrade called the Lin upgrade that fixes a lot of the issues that these were shipped out kind of partially complete and not completely working in all cases. Some of them apparently are in great condition, but a lot of them are not. So what's unique about the Memorymoog? What's unique is that it has 3 oscillators, which is not common. It's a 6-voice, but it has 3 oscillators, which most of the other polyphonic megasynths only were 2 oscillators. So you had 18 VCOs, so you get, and you can put them all in unison, and so you get this massive kind of sound, wall of sound. And with the 3 oscillators, you can also detune them, and so you can make these very, very complex, very overwhelming sounds with the Memorymoog. Whereas on a Jupiter-8, you have 2 oscillators, and the sounds are a lot cleaner. They don't necessarily take up the entire mix. It has a powerful unison mode, but the Memorymoog has this unique 3 oscillator build that makes it different than some of the other flagship Titan polyphonic analog synths. I would say that's probably the most different thing about it. It also has a ladder filter, which was Moog's kind of claim to fame, is his ladder filter. And the Memorymoog has the ladder filter in it, and it's combined with Curtis chip VCOs, which sometimes people think that Curtis chip VCOs are not as good as discrete VCOs, but it works incredibly well with the Memorymoog. And people have said the reason is that the filter, the ladder filter, works really nicely with Curtis chips, as opposed to some like the Jupiter-6, which also has Curtis chips, and the filter in the Jupiter-6 is not a ladder filter, and so people sometimes say that they don't like the Jupiter-6 sound as much as the Jupiter-8 sound. A lot of people that have own Memorymoogs or that play on them, it's a really nice combination. Or just the way it was implemented and engineered, it just works. So the cons that are usually associated with Curtis chips, really, from a sonic standpoint, when you're playing the Memorymoog, it doesn't seem like it's much of a con in this case. What else is interesting about it is there's a lot of modulation possibilities. It's kind of like a Prophet 5 and its modulation destinations. And it had up to 100 presets that you could store. Both of these instruments were pre-MIDI. You could get a Memorymoog MIDI kit installed. The Memorymoog Plus had the MIDI kit. But neither of these necessarily came with MIDI. It was right around the time MIDI was invented, and so Jupiter-8 didn't have one at all, and you had to get it retrofitted if you wanted it, and the Memorymoog had it as an option. The thing that distinguishes the Memorymoog really is the 3 VCOs and the ladder filter. One other interesting note about the VCOs is that you can select multiple wave shapes at the same time, which is something that you can do with Curtis chips that you couldn't do with discrete oscillators, at least as far as I know. But you could select multiple waveforms on the VCOs to allow for more complex kind of waveform generation, which is a cool feature. So that's really what's super unique about the Memorymoog. It has a Moog sound. It doesn't sound like a mini Moog. It sounds like its own beast, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's been described as kind of something that's difficult to tame in a mix. You have to know what you're doing. It's a really powerful instrument. So now to the Jupiter-8, which stands in contrast in that this instrument is very easily inserted into a mix. Also came at the tail end of Roland's analog era. It's considered to be probably the pinnacle or the zenith of Roland's analog polysynth creation. Nothing else really aspired to be what this was. The Jupiter-8 is considered to be the best polysynth that Roland ever created. And rightly so. It's a discrete design, so it has discrete analog VCOs. It's got an incredibly rich sound. It's got the filter on it also is incredibly, it just has this magical tone about it. The layout is really great. Roland synths from this time are incredibly intuitive and fun to play. I think they've really nailed the sound design framework. It's very simple and very intuitive. And it also had a lot of cool kind of complexity that you don't find in other mega polyanalog synths like the Memorymoog. So it had a dual mode, it had a split mode, and it also had a great kind of mod wheel that you could assign different parameters to. And it had a second LFO with a little button to trigger the second LFO. All of which are small details, but it allows you to sound sculpt in very intuitive and easy ways that you don't really find in a lot of, kind of after this, things went crazy and people started adding so many features and you got into menus and menu diving, and this was all kind of right there in front of you for you to sculpt. And it really, when you play with it, it really is very intuitive. What's also unique about it is from this time, it was the first polyphonic analog synth to have a unison mode that did voice allocation. So when you play it, it's not just a monophonic synth. It can dynamically allocate out notes up to 8. But you hit 2 notes and it splits the oscillators 4 and 4. You hit 4 notes, it splits them 2 on each note and all the way up to 8. And that was unique at the time for polyphonic analog synths. So really, this was about as just as many units sold for the Jupiter-8 as the Memorymoog. It was about 3,300 is the number that I found. So both of these units, about 3,000 to 3,500 were produced. It's interesting, though, the Jupiter-8 has been more present, I think, in history, probably because they work. They're incredibly well built, and they're not known for being trouble synths. So probably got a lot more use because a lot of the Memorymoogs needed work, and a lot of times people didn't do the work. So they're probably, the Memorymoog feels rare, even though the same amount were kind of in production. I think because a lot of people probably threw it away or got lost because it wasn't working. Whereas the Jupiter-8 doesn't really have a lot of issues, so they all are probably still in circulation. And folks sometimes describe the Jupiter-8 sound as a lot happier or kind of poppy than the Memorymoog sound. And I think that's true to some extent. I think you can get darker tones out of a Jupiter-8 and warm, kind of lower end tones, but it really does excel in kind of a brighter, poppier, kind of synth pop sound, whereas the Memorymoog really excels in heavier, bassier, kind of more full-bodied tones. So tonally, that's really where they differ. People say you can't really compare these because they're such different sonic palettes. It's not really a fair comparison. And I would agree with that. These are two different instruments with two different sounds. So it's not something like where you're comparing the quality level differences. You're really comparing two, like a Les Paul and a Fender Strat. Yes, they're both electric guitars, but the tone profile of each is pretty different, just like the Jupiter-8 tone profile and the Memorymoog profile are pretty different. So all that said, let's get into these, let's play them so you can hear for yourself what they sound like and determine which sound you like better. So if I had to describe sonically the tonal characteristic of the Memorymoog versus the Jupiter-8, I would say the Memorymoog is massive, fat, super full-bodied, and the Roland is more elegant, more sculpted, a little bit more magical and ethereal sounding. They really are completely different tonally, and the palette that you get with each of these is pretty different. So you probably have a preference one way or the other depending on the type of music that you write, that you play. I personally am more of a Roland Jupiter sound guy, but that's just me. And when you talk about reliability and ease of use, I would say the Jupiter-8 is definitely more reliable and easy to use than the Memorymoog. And I would also say that in terms of value, the Jupiter-8 commands a higher price on the kind of vintage market than the Memorymoog. Is that justified? I don't know. It just happens to be the case. So those are really, to me, the differences between the two units from a kind of sonic standpoint, monetary standpoint, and a ease of use and kind of layout standpoint. I think, again, the feature set differences are that the Memorymoog has its 3 VCOs and the ladder filter, while the Jupiter-8 has 2 VCOs, but has more key modes with the dual split layering ability. It's 8 voice, where the Memorymoog is a 6 voice. So they're different. Not only are they sonically different, but from a kind of sound design standpoint, there's some fundamental differences in what you have to work with that really constrain or open up different possibilities. What's possible on the Jupiter-8 is not totally possible on the Memorymoog, and vice versa. So I think these are both magical. It was my privilege today to get to talk about and play them. I know I probably left facts out about both of these and maybe even mixed up a few facts, so I'd love to hear your feedback below about things that were left out, that were interesting, that should have been covered, and also which one you liked better. Which one do you think would you rather have in your collection? Some cool options on the modern market for if you liked either of these synths. The Moog 1 by Moog is definitely in the vein of the Memorymoog. It actually has even more VCOs. I think it has something like, it's 16 voice and it has 3 oscillators, so do the math. That's an insane amount of oscillators, and you can put it into a monophonic unison mode, which is completely insane. There's some videos online. You should check it out. The Jupiter-8 is only available in Roland's kind of digital emulation ACB, ACM technology. So the Jupiter-X, their Roland Cloud, the JP-8. There's a lot of, and Arturia makes one as well. Arturia makes a VST software. So there's a number of VSTs that have recreated the JP-8, but nobody has done a modern analog version of the JP-8, and which speaks to kind of the rarity and the differentness of this era of polyphonic analog synths. As a closing note, I want to just talk about it a little bit more for a sec. The Moog 1 by Moog is like $9,000. So there's a reason nobody is building these massive poly analog synths from the golden era anymore. To rebuild them in today's world would end user $8-9 grand as with Moog. So manufacturers haven't been willing to put the premium material and premium development cost into analog synths like they were in the late 80s, early 70s. I mean, late 70s, early 80s. So it's kind of sad. These are super unique. You could really only get them in vintage versions minus the Prophet reissues and Moog 1. So it's curious to see what's going to happen in the next few years with the renewed interest in analog synthesizers. Will manufacturers step up to the plate and recreate some of the magic from this golden era and perhaps create something completely new? Time will only tell. I'm super excited. Again, you can find us on alamomusic.com. Hit subscribe, turn on the notifications if you haven't already, and let us know what we can do more of. Talk to you soon.